Hello and welcome back. This is the week 13 lecture. So today I would like to talk about Washington Irving and the two short stories of his that I posted in this week's module. The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, which is probably his most famous work, and also Dolph Haliger, which is one of my favorite texts by him. So I want to talk about both of those, but also let's just talk a little bit more generally about Irving and let's situate him in this sort of timeline or this history that we're telling about the development of American literature. So I've already mentioned him a little bit when we were talking about Sedgwick over the previous 2 weeks. So they are contemporaries, they are peers. Irving is another member of this second generation of American writers that we've been talking about. So the first generation, Rowson, Brown, Foster, they're all dead by the 1820s, and this new crop of writers kind of emerges and really starts to popularize American literature in many ways. They build on what that earlier generation had done, but they sort of take American literature to new heights, and Irving is often thought of as the member of that group that does that the most. So in the 1820s, Irving becomes something of a celebrity. He becomes pretty famous, pretty well known, not just in the US, but also abroad. So he is often considered kind of the first American literary export, the first American author to become pretty popular overseas in places like England and France. So that's pretty significant when we're talking about the history of American literature. There had been other popular authors before him. And I think it's important to remember that Rowson wrote the first bestseller in America, Charlotte Temple, and that book continued to be immensely popular all the way up until the 1850s, when Uncle Tom's Cabin, another sentimental novel written by, in this case, Harriet Beecher Stowe, finally surpassed it. But also remember The Coquette by Hannah Webster Foster was also a bestseller in the 1790s, but it was published anonymously, so Foster was never well known as an author. And even Rowson, though she was known as an author, she was also known as an educator and an actress. So it is probably fair to argue that Irving was sort of the first famous American author, and one of the first American authors to really make his living exclusively through his writing. So in some ways, he's a little bit similar to Charles Brontë Brown in the sense of being kind of this all-purpose man of letters. He wrote fiction, but not novels. He really only wrote short fiction, like the two works that we're looking at today, and he also wrote a lot of nonfiction. A lot of sort of essays or just little short sketches of like everyday life and particular parts of the world. He traveled widely. So he also wrote a lot of what we would call travel literature, travel logs. Just sort of describing places that he visited, describing the people, local customs, local geography. That remains a pretty popular genre of writing even today, but it's not fiction. He also wrote history. He wrote biography. When he died in the 1850s, he was working on this massive multi-volume biography of George Washington, his namesake. So he, like Brown, he worked in a lot of different fields of writing. He did a lot of different types of writing. He was not exclusively a fiction writer, but unlike Brown and unlike almost all of the other writers we've looked at so far this semester, Irving did not write novels. So again, he was really more of a nonfiction writer, and he did short fiction, early versions of short stories, kind of almost like as a side gig, almost like a hobby. It was not his primary mode of writing. And after maybe like 1825, he really didn't write very much fiction at all for the rest of his career. But we remember him best today largely for some of these famous short fictional works like The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, like Rip Van Winkle. Dolph Haliger is remembered a little bit less, but I think it's one of his best works, so we'll definitely jump into that. But yeah, Irving in the past has been called the father or the grandfather of American literature. He's been often credited as kind of the first really famous, really popular American author. And that's largely true. I don't think we should forget totally about Susanna Ralston, but that probably is largely true. And Irving probably deserves that designation. But in many ways, despite his importance and despite how celebrated he was during his time, and I think we'll see some of the reasons why. He's kind of fun, he's comic, he has kind of a lighthearted style that people respond well to. But despite all of that, he's still kind of old-fashioned in many ways. I think especially compared to Sedgwick. And again, they're contemporaries, they're writing at the same time, but they're writing very different stuff. But they are engaged in some of the same pursuits. So if you remember, in relation to Sedgwick and Hope Leslie, we were talking about the search for a national literature. And that had been going on for a long time, really since the beginning of America, but in the beginning of the U.S. But in the 1820s, calls for a uniquely national literature got louder and more persistent, and writers really started to think more about what it was that they could use as sort of unique subject material, subject matter. Like, what could they use from the U.S. that was truly unique and had no analogs or no parallels overseas with other countries, other cultures, other literary traditions. So we talked about some of these things in relation to Sedgwick and the frontier romance genre of novels that was getting big in the 1820s. And like we said, Hope Leslie is an example of one of those novels. Also, the works of Cooper, The Last of the Mohicans, The Prairie, which we're no longer reading. But those were really big novels, and they were very much about historicizing America, sort of reclaiming older parts of U.S. history, which largely involved conflict between European settlers and Native Americans, like we talked about with Sedgwick. So that's one way that writers were trying to sort of find uniquely national subject matter. But we also talked about cultural differences between regions, like regional characteristics within the U.S. So, Puritan New England compared to the South or the Mid-Atlantic, where you would have seen different immigration patterns, slightly different customs, slightly different cultures. So we're getting another corner, another unique region of the U.S. in these two stories by Irving. So with Sedgwick, again, we were sort of revisiting the old history of Puritan New England. With Irving, we're going back to old Dutch New York. And so again, Irving is engaged in this same kind of historicizing process. He wants to tell a history of a particular corner of the country, but he's also kind of celebrating difference. He's celebrating the ways that the descendants of these early Dutch settlers have kind of maintained certain aspects of their culture and their history and their customs despite the rapid modernization and the rapid change that really characterizes the U.S. in the early 19th century. So Irving's really engaged in an interesting dance, I think, in these two texts. And we'll talk more about it as we move through the text. But again, like Sedgwick, he's interested in history, a unique U.S. history. He's not as interested in the Native American aspect of that history. He's interested in the sort of non-English settlement of New York. Of course, the English took possession of New York, what would later become the state of New York, or in the 1660s. But prior to that, the Dutch had already been there. Dutch settlers, from what we would now call the Netherlands, or sometimes we still call it Holland, where Amsterdam is. Dutch settlers had already come over and begun colonizing the area, really beginning in the 1620s. So a good 40 or 50 years before the English defeated the Dutch in battle and basically took possession of that territory. So the Dutch were in New York City. They established New York City. It was originally New Amsterdam. They bought the island of Manhattan from the local Native Americans, the Lenape tribe, what we call the Delawares. That's like the Anglo name for the tribe. But yeah, the Dutch bought the island of Manhattan. They established what would later become New York City. And they also had a presence all the way up in what we would kind of think of as like upstate New York, extending all the way up to Albany, kind of following the Hudson River. So that was originally Dutch. Those were Dutch settlers. And even after the English took possession in the 1660s, a lot of the Dutch stayed. Even though they were under English control, they stayed and they were able to maintain a certain degree of their unique culture, language, Dutch churches, Dutch architecture. So Irving wants to kind of celebrate that, particularly in The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, and he's making a very clear point, and he's really wanting us to understand this tension that's very true, throughout America. It's really typical of America in the first half of the 19th century, this tension between progress and tradition. Because, this isn't a history class, but you guys know that in the first half of the 19th century, the U.S. was acquiring huge amounts of land. The Louisiana Purchase first, and then there were additional big land acquisitions throughout the first half of the century, culminating at the end of the 1840s with the Mexican-American War. At the end of that war, of course, we pushed all the way out to the Pacific, took possession of what had previously been Spain, and then Mexico, California, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico. Texas had kind of already broken away, but all of the Southwest, Far West, Mountain West was U.S. by 1850. So the first half of the 19th century is really defined by rapid change, rapid territorial expansion, and the narrative that we often learn is that everybody in America was pro-westward expansion, and certainly many were. But that wasn't necessarily a consensus. Not everybody wanted to push to the Pacific, and there was this kind of concern that as we continued to gobble up more land and more people, what was going to happen to our culture and some of our older traditions. But there was also this struggle that kind of repeats itself throughout U.S. history of U.S. westward expansion, meaning that new groups of people come under the control of Anglo-America, the dominant sort of descendants of the English settlers. So this plays out in a lot of ways. Obviously, Native Americans are the first group to sort of get displaced and defeated, but in various ways this happens to other groups as well. The Dutch, the French, these other colonial presences that were in North America in the early days of colonization, they get pushed out slowly by the English. The Dutch are out by the end of the 17th century. The French are defeated maybe 60 years later. But again, once we push out to, say, the Mississippi River a little later on, we're going to encounter French communities, French-speaking people who had settled there under French authority. They stayed put. For a while, they were able to maintain their culture. The same process would play out later when we assumed control of land previously controlled by Spain and then Mexico. So we subsume Spanish-speaking populations. So that's, in many ways, kind of the story of U.S. westward expansion. It's a story of assimilation in some ways, different groups getting assimilated into sort of mainstream Anglo-American culture and society. That's not always a smooth process, as we can imagine. So Irving's kind of interested in all of that. And he's interested in how certain pockets of old Dutch New York, at least up through the 18th century, up to maybe the very beginning of the 19th century, had remained sort of culturally distinct in the face of all of this rapid change that really characterized the young nation. So he's sort of celebrating that, but we're also aware, I think, in some ways, that the change is going to come. And we're reminded that America is kind of caught between wanting to honor certain traditions, certain cultural traditions, and sort of celebrating some of our difference, some of our unique regional characteristics, while at the same time we're pushing, we're gaining, we're fighting, we're acquiring. There's a lot of acquisition that seems to kind of come into conflict with some of these other impulses that we have to kind of preserve and maintain certain aspects of our history and celebrate cultural difference. So it's weird, it's ambiguous, and it leads to a lot of ambiguity in the texts. So let's just jump into the Legend of Sleepy Hollow first. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on it, and I definitely don't want to summarize the plot because you guys know the plot. This story has really made its way into our popular culture. Even if you haven't read the original text by Irving, you know this story. Maybe you've seen a film adaptation, maybe you've seen it sort of portrayed in cartoons or television, but the story is pretty familiar. But again, we're in Old Dutch New York along the Hudson River and Tarrytown, which is a real place, and it's not far from New York City. But culturally, it's distinct from the sort of hustle and bustle of the big city. We're in a kind of rural, quiet, sort of pastoral environment here. Our setting is very much supposed to be kind of peaceful, tranquil, and Irving wants us to understand that not much has changed here for a long time. So if you look at sort of early in the text, I just want to sort of, drive a little bit of this home in some of his early descriptions. When he talks about a drowsy, dreamy influence that seemed to hang over the land and pervade the very atmosphere. So he tells us that this is really a good place for legends and tales and ghost stories and certain superstitions that have been there for a long time. They're a part of that unique regional history. And because not a lot has changed here, the legends and the stories have remained largely intact. So if you look over this is on pages 3 and 4 of the PDF that I posted. So if you look on page 4, he's really kind of expounding on this a little bit more. This is the second paragraph on the page. I mentioned this peaceful spot with all possible laud, for it is in such little retired Dutch valleys, found here and there embosomed in the great state of New York, that population, manners, and customs remain fixed, while the great torrent of migration and improvement, which is making such incessant changes in other parts of this restless country, sweeps by them unobserved. So notice the distinction, right? All this rapid development, all of this rapid progress characterizing America, but all of that stuff is kind of separate from this quiet little river valley, this little town, this small secluded space that's still kind of culturally Dutch, and it's separate and distinct from the main currents of American life. So then he goes into this kind of extended metaphor about how there's some little bodies of water, again, representing this particular place, in which, the water is kind of stagnant, right? He doesn't quite say it that way, but he's pointing out that we have all this onrushing water elsewhere, but then we have little nooks of still water. They might border a rapid stream, but they're not moving. That water in the little nook, it's not moving rapidly like the water in the stream. So again, this is the relationship of this place to the larger country that's changing and growing so rapidly. So Irving wants to make that clear. That this place is still sort of culturally Dutch, and a lot of these superstitions and sort of tall tales and ghost stories that permeate the place are, again, they're byproducts of that unique history. So the headless horseman that's supposed to kind of, be a local ghost terrorizing eventually terrorizing Ichabod, the Headless Horseman is supposed to be the ghost of a Hessian soldier from the American Revolution. Hessians were like German mercenaries who fought on the side of the British during the Revolution. So again, there were a lot of key battles during the Revolution fought here, and a lot of the descendants of the original Dutch settlers were fighting on the side of independence. So the Hessians were kind of on the wrong side, and this is a fallen Hessian soldier who still haunts the area, according to local lore and legend. But again, Irving wants us to know that it's because this place hasn't changed a lot. It's because this place has maintained its unique culture and history. That's why these stories still have such currency. That's why these ghost stories are still so popular and still kind of hold sway over the local population. Like the local people believe those ghost stories. But then we have Ichabod, our protagonist. And Ichabod's not Dutch, and Ichabod is not from there. And you need to keep that in mind because that's important. I believe he comes from Connecticut, so not far away, but he's not a part of this kind of unique cultural milieu, right? He's a newcomer. He's an itinerant schoolmaster who's come to live here, but he's not a local. So he's different, right? And he's also kind of a comic character, just the way he's described, his appearance. He's kind of a goofy guy, but like the locals, he's also kind of into folklore and local legends, and he's very interested in witchcraft. So at one point we see him by the river, kind of relaxing, reading a book during some of his downtime, and the book that he's reading is Cotton Mather's History of Witchcraft, which is a real book, and Cotton Mather was a real person, an important figure in Puritan New England history. So the point's being made there that even though Crane is not really a part of this Dutch New York community, he, like them, is superstitious. And he buys into a lot of these ghost stories, including the one about, of course, the Headless Horseman. So the thing to remember about Ichabod, though, he is our main character, but we have to ask ourselves, how sympathetic is he? Like, are we really invited to root for him and like him? He's comic. We sort of laugh at him. I think in a lot of pop culture sort of renditions of this story, Ichabod's made into kind of an unlikely hero in opposition to Brom, Brom Bones, who's kind of the bully and kind of the antagonist. But even though Ichabod does kind of occupy that main character or protagonist role, not everything we learn about him is necessarily favorable. So one critic put it well, I think. They said when it comes to Ichabod, the three key words are acquisition, ambition, and self-interest. So Ichabod in many ways kind of represents America. That's how a lot of people read the character. He's kind of uncouth. He's kind of awkward. It's this sense that America's just finally kind of coming into its own. It's kind of reaching maturity as a nation. And like what we were seeing throughout the nation at this time, Ichabod doesn't want to stay in this quiet, sleepy corner of upstate New York forever. He might kind of enjoy it to an extent, but he has his eyes set on bigger prizes. So when he's courting Katrina, obviously we know that he's very taken with her beauty and he's charmed by her, but also keep in mind that he's very enamored with her family's wealth. The Van Tassels have a lot of money. They're one of these old Dutch families that have been there for a very long time. Their presence predates the English presence in the area, so they have a lot of money. They're a very prominent family. So that's a big part of it for Ichabod. And if you notice, I didn't write this page number down, but as you're reading through, notice some of the fantasies that he has or some of the dreams or visions that he has for his future life should he win the hand of Katrina. He's not just thinking about her. He's thinking about the money that will come along with her. And he's not really thinking about staying there in New York, in Tarrytown. At one point, he visualizes selling off the ancestral land of the Van Tassels, getting a lot of money for it, and then setting out for new places. I think they mentioned Kentucky and Tennessee, new settlements, like new states, places that were sort of still considered to be kind of wild and the West, but again, this is representing westward expansion. This is that slow process of gobbling up increasing amounts of land from Native Americans, from other European colonial powers in some cases. We were getting land from Spain, we were getting land from France, New York came from the Dutch. So this process is continuing, but Ichabod wants to strike out and make his way in some of these new territories that had just recently kind of been established. So Ichabod's very representative. He's very symbolic of the young republic and how it was growing. He's also described as a big eater. I think Irving's narrator calls him a great feeder. And again, this is not incidental. This is not just a comic detail that we're supposed to laugh at, right? Ichabod wants more. He's all about consuming. He's never full. And for some, like some kind of slightly old-fashioned perspectives, they might have seen, and again, maybe it wasn't even an old-fashioned perspective, but there was certainly a way of viewing American expansion as maybe not always a good thing. And for someone like Irving, who really did sort of cherish tradition and a certain adherence to the old ways, it was very unsettling. It was very kind of destabilizing to think about constantly acquiring new land, new settlement, people leaving their ancestral homes along the seaboard and pushing west. Not everybody was on board with it, and I don't think that Irving is wholeheartedly endorsing it in this story. But if you jump to the end, we kind of have to make up our own minds about Ichabod. But again, obviously he's sort of terrorized by what he thinks is a ghost. It turns out to just be Brom playing a prank on him. So that's another interesting thing. This is often held up, this text is held up as kind of a classic example of an American ghost story. So again, Irving's really an innovator on a lot of levels. He's often given credit for being among the first short story practitioners. I think I mentioned that. Also one of the first sort of mainstream authors to popularize, what would later be celebrated ghost stories. So he's kind of setting down some templates and formulas. Again, there's already Gothic fiction, but a lot of the conventions that we see here fit into the more sort of, into like, if we wanted to think of the ghost story as kind of a subgenre. Again, he didn't invent it, but he's popularizing it and making it sort of uniquely American or unique to the U.S. in certain ways. So that's all true, but as much credit as he gets for kind of popularizing the ghost story in U.S. literature, it's interesting to note what he does at the end of the narrative, where he makes it quite clear that these legends, these superstitions, they're not real, right? And what we learn is that Ichabod has just been the victim of an elaborate prank. But if we actually go, I've lost my place now, but if you go to the end of the text, near the end, when we're getting a little summary of what Ichabod does later, after he leaves Tarrytown. So a lot of the locals think that the Headless Horseman got him and that, he's dead. But we get the actual account from our narrator. And let me find this here I'm actually using a hard copy here. So this is like the second to last paragraph of the story. And he's basically filling us in on what Ichabod does later in life. And this is important. So it is true, an old farmer who had been down to New York on a visit several years after received intelligence that Ichabod was still alive and that he left the neighborhood, partly through fear of the goblin, partly through fear of Hans von Ripper, one of his neighbors, who I think he borrowed the horse from, and partly in mortification of having been suddenly dismissed by the heiress, so his marriage proposal is turned down by Katrina. But anyway, he moves away. And here's what he does next. He kept school and studied law at the same time, had been admitted to the bar, turned politician, electioneered, written for the newspapers, and finally had been made a justice of the 10-pound court. Okay, so what's the significance of those details? Well, notice the different things that he's doing, right? So he writes for the newspapers, he becomes a politician, he goes to school, becomes a lawyer, and then later he becomes a justice of the 10-pound court. If you guys don't know what that means, you probably don't. I didn't when I first read this story. It was kind of a legal practice, kind of unique to New England and the Northeast, but basically it was just a way to like expedite civil cases. Any civil court case involving 10 pounds or less, like outstanding debts, anything involving 10 pounds or less could basically be adjudicated by a single judge without a jury. So these were kind of small civil cases that judges could kind of reach a verdict on without any further consultation or deliberation. So he eventually becomes kind of a small-time judge, becomes a politician, and he does kind of follow his ambition, and he goes and strikes out in new parts of the country. But then we get the contrast. Brom Bones, we learn, marries Katrina, and from what we can probably gather, they stay, right? They stay put. So there's this reminder that nothing is really changing yet in Tarrytown, but Ichabod is changing. Ichabod leaves, and Ichabod does all of these different things, which are kind of all characteristic or representative in various ways of America. He becomes a politician. He gets involved in the law. He travels. He does different things. He writes. He gets involved in journalism. So, like a lot of Americans, he wears many hats. He's always looking for a new adventure. He's ambitious. He wants to make money. And that, for better or worse, that was becoming a defining characteristic of the sort of American character at this time. So again, that's all kind of important to the overall meaning of this text. What do we value? What do we prize? The sort of progress and ambition personified by Ichabod, or the sort of adherence to tradition and the old ways that we get from the sort of alternate, the alternate path that Brom and Katrina take, and that most of the other residents of this area generally do. They stay put, and we're supposed to celebrate their local culture and these local legends and superstitions, but at the same time, Irving shows us, like I said, that the superstitions are not real. And that they're just kind of founded on, idle gossip and sort of outlandish beliefs. So even after we learn all of this, he still says, but the old wives in the neighborhood were still convinced that, something bad had happened to Ichabod. So I think Irving, as he often does, he's adopting kind of a satirical tone, and it's really, the satire is kind of directed at everyone. To a large extent, nobody really escapes. So we are invited to laugh at Ichabod, but we're also kind of invited to laugh at a lot of these Dutch, or the descendants of the original Dutch settlers, who are very stuck in their ways, and they're kind of parochial. They're kind of bumpkins to a certain extent, to use a modern term, right? They don't really know much of the wider world. And Ichabod's different. Ichabod has that ambition, which does kind of make him distinct. But again, what is Irving valuing more? What are we supposed to value more? Progress or tradition? We have to decide. And then also think about what he's doing with the ghost story. What does it mean to have kind of a spooky story? I mean, again, it's largely comic, but as Ichabod's coming back from the party, and he's kind of getting all these false alarms, we see a lot of templates there, a lot of what will become very standard later in American horror films. And the sort of visual representations of ghost stories. So again, like Brown, Irving is kind of in at the ground floor of some of these conventions. Again, some of it gets passed down from earlier Gothic literature, but Irving's helping to really sort of popularized the ghost story, kind of taking it from the realm of like oral storytelling where it had already existed and kind of making it a staple of literature. So we see a lot of modern sort of horror movie templates there, but then at the end, when everything's revealed, maybe some of those scares are kind of cheapened or, subverted in some ways because we learn the truth and we realize that there is no headless horseman. This is all kind of a silly myth. And Ichabod falls for it, which is funny. But what does it mean that Irving wants to reveal the truth? Does it take away from our celebration of this unique culture, this unique regional corner of the U.S.? Okay, so that's enough on the Legend of Sleepy Hollow. I want to jump into Dolph in the next segment, in part 2. So we'll come back and we'll talk about a much less known, less talked about story, but it might actually be Irving's best.